For over 5,000 years, human civilization hasn't just been built on power, it's been built on the invisible systems that control that power. It's wild when you think about it. From the Great Pyramids all the way to the phone that's probably in your hand right now, there's always been an architecture of control. So let's do this. Let's deconstruct that architecture together, piece by piece.
This quote? Wow. It just perfectly frames the journey we're about to take. We're going to peel back the layers of history, one by one, to really get how these massive civilizational operating systems have changed. And it's a wild story, really, about how control has gotten smarter, more personal, and, in the end, almost completely invisible.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're looking at 5 major eras, and I want you to think of each one as running on a totally new software, a new operating system for humanity. We're going to see how each one got started, why it took over, and the brutal realities it created before the next, even more powerful version came along and replaced it. And it all leads right up to the system we're all living in today. Okay, let's dive in. Our story starts way back in the great river valleys of the ancient world. We're talking the Nile, the Tigris, the Indus. This is where the very first system of mass control was born. And it didn't come from some grand idea or philosophy. Nope. It came from something way more basic: water.
I mean, just think about it for a second. To survive, you absolutely had to tame those rivers. But how do you do that? You need massive irrigation projects, right? And to build those, you need a central authority, someone powerful enough to get tens of thousands of people to work together. So it all boils down to this, and it's so important. Whoever controlled the water controlled life itself. And hey, if you control life, well, you might as well be a god, right? So that's what happened. Rulers became these divine figures. Their power came from being able to predict the floods and manage the grain stores. But here's the catch. This whole system was built on forced labor, which made it super fragile. And sure enough, around 1200 BCE, the whole thing just collapsed. It was the Bronze Age collapse. A total perfect storm of climate change, migrations, new tech, and it threw pretty much the whole known world into a dark age.
So, out of all that chaos, a brand new, much more scalable system gets installed: empire. And this was a total game changer. It wasn't about gods and myths anymore. No, this was about building a machine for conquest, for administration, for law, a machine that could stretch across entire continents.
So, what was the new technology that made this all possible? Iron. All of a sudden, weapons were cheap and easy to make. That meant you could have huge professional armies, which meant you could conquer huge territories. But you got to pay for those armies, right? Which means you need taxes. And to collect all those taxes, you need a whole class of professional administrators, what we call a bureaucracy. And just like that, the state wasn't some divine thing anymore. It was a well-oiled machine.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. You can see how different empires were basically running on different software. You had Rome, which goes from a republic to what you could call Caesarism, basically an empire run by a military strongman. Then you look east to Han China, and they've got a meritocracy run by these scholar officials. But here's the thing, they both shared that same core idea of the state as a machine. And just like any software, both had fatal bugs. Assassinations in Rome, crazy court politics in China, and eventually, those bugs caused the whole system to crash.
So the great empires are gone. The world just shatters. Central authority vanished. All of a sudden, security is a local business. And this fragmentation gives rise to a whole new operating system, one where power isn't in the hands of legions and bureaucrats anymore. Now, it's held by local lords and by universal faiths.
The deal was pretty simple and pretty brutal. You give up your freedom, you give up your labor, and in exchange, you get protection behind a lord's castle wall. Power became super local. But what held it all together? What was the social glue? Religion. It became the ultimate authority, not just over who owned what piece of land, but over the human soul itself.
And what's fascinating is that this era cooked up really different models for how to run society. Over in Europe, you get feudalism, right? It's all legitimized by the divine right of kings, and the clergy basically had a monopoly on all knowledge. But in the Islamic world, a totally different model takes shape. It was built on the idea of consultation, or shura, and the ruler himself was subject to the law. They even created something called the millet system, which gave non-Muslim communities their own legal independence, plus they had a mandatory social welfare system. It created this incredibly pluralistic and stable society that lasted for centuries.
But that whole decentralized world,
It was on the verge of being completely shattered by the next big system upgrade. All of a sudden, faith in feudal lords were made obsolete by two revolutionary new forces, gunpowder and capital. And this, right here, is the birth of the world we recognize today, a world of separate sovereign nations, the Westphalian Order.
Gunpowder literally changed everything. It was the great centralizer. Suddenly, a king with a few cannons could just blow away the castle of any lord who got out of line. But cannons are expensive, right? So to pay for these new armies, kings partnered up with merchants. They funded colonial expeditions that brought back unimaginable wealth. And the justification for all this power, it wasn't God anymore. It was raison d'etat, this idea that the interest of the state itself is more important than anything else.
So as this system grew up, industrialization comes along and gives the state a level of power it had never, ever had before. Now, it wasn't just about controlling territory. The state could actually try to control the mind of every single citizen, using mass media and propaganda. Power wasn't just about controlling bodies anymore. It was about controlling what people believed.
And just like that, ideas became weapons. You had liberalism, communism, and fascism all fighting for control of the planet in a brutal century of what they called total war. And for the first time in our entire history, we, as a species, created systems powerful enough to literally wipe ourselves off the map. And that brings us to today, right now. The great ideological wars, they seem to be over. But a new, much quieter, much more subtle system of control has slid into its place. And this one doesn't live in government buildings or palaces. It lives in the invisible digital world that's all around us.
What we're living in today is kind of like a digital panopticon. There are no god kings, no emperors. Instead, the real power, the real control belongs to the people who design the algorithms, the people who train the AI. And this is absolutely crucial, the people who control the supply chains for the semiconductors that make our entire world go round. This is the new front line. This is the new battleground.
And this is where it gets really personal for you and me, because this system isn't just about controlling countries anymore, it's about influencing you. Every single time you click, you like something, you search for something, you're feeding this giant machine, a machine that's designed to measure you, predict what you'll do next, and ultimately shape your behavior. And sometimes it does that with biases we're only just starting to figure out. In this new world, there are no kings. We're all just data points.
So, when you step back and look at the big picture, you can see this whole 5,000-year journey. It's incredible. What started with controlling something essential for survival, water, has evolved into controlling the one thing essential for our modern lives, data. Each step along the way has been a huge leap towards a more efficient, a more widespread, and a much more personal kind of power.
Which leaves us with this final question. The architecture of power keeps changing, keeps upgrading, but the game itself, it's still the same. The future isn't going to be controlled by the people who just have the most power. It's going to be controlled by the ones who understand the system that creates it in the first place.